Erin E. Kelly is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Victoria, where she also serves as director of the university's academic and technical writing program. She has published articles and essays on topics including John Fox's Acts and Monuments, Middleton's Revenger's Tragedy, and Nathaniel Woods's Conflict of Conscience. As an associate editor for the journal Early Theatre, Erin encourages anyone presenting work or attending sessions at this year's CSRS conference to approach her with questions about publishing their research concerning medieval and early modern English drama. Today's paper is part of a larger project exploring the complexities of early Tudor drama. Erin's paper today is called Time for Early Tudor Drama.
Thank you all so much. My paper now has a subtitle. After Time for Early Tudor Drama, let's call this paper When Was Godly Queen Hester? And before I jump in, I want to mention that I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. That would be the Sankes, Esquimalt, and Wasanich nations, whose relationship to the land continues to this day, and I'm really grateful to be able to work from this beautiful place. We know that much of what we think of as medieval drama isn't medieval, or isn't simply medieval. For example, the last complete performance of the Chester cycle took place in 1575, not the Middle Ages. Surviving manuscripts that record this cycle date to between 1590 and 1600. And these texts, along with other documents, suggest that individual Chester plays were repeatedly revised well into the second half of the 16th century. Therefore, although this biblical cycle likely had 14th century origins, it is not inaccurate to say that some of the Chester plays are examples of Tudor drama. While the impacts of Tudor culture on so-called medieval drama were once seen as accretions that should be stripped away, scholars, among whom I find Richard Emerson's work particularly interesting, have developed rich readings by considering how these plays might have been performed and received differently at discrete moments across the 16th century. Recognizing that plays and their reception can change across time has generated more complex ways of contextualizing and thus of understanding medieval drama. But it remains unusual to find studies that take a similar approach to plays that originated during the early Tudor period. Literary periodization and theater history often conceptualize boundaries between medieval and early modern drama that leave the texts first created after the start of the Tudor dynasty in 1485, but before the flourishing of London's commercial theaters in the 1580s as a no man's land. Recent early modern drama studies often, at best, devote a chapter to early Tudor drama in order to offer contexts for what emerged as dominant themes, practices, or conventions in the 1590s. And article or essay-length arguments focused on particular plays still overwhelmingly work to pin down an author, patron, or original performance date and venue. More general claims about early Tudor drama are arguably difficult to make because of the relative scarcity and idiosyncratic nature of the playtexts that survive for us to study. In this paper, I'm attempting to demonstrate what happens when we take an approach to early Tudor drama more akin to the diachronic, multivalent understandings now common in work on medieval cycle plays and other medieval drama. These ways of reading consider the quirks of a single play's survival an important subject of study. I start by assuming origin stories are no more significant than the tales we tell about the interventions that have preserved a playtext for us to read. Here I use as a case study the anonymous godly Queen Hester, showing how we might think of this play as not just linked to its likely moment of composition during the reign of Henry VIII, but also as a continuously evolving text, one that could be used as a script, a record of performance, and a text for reading over many decades. In doing so, I suggest some interpretive possibilities that could result from carefully complicating the temporal contexts of early Tudor drama. And in my conclusion, I briefly mention a few of what I'm increasingly seeing as many, many other plays that invite similar investigation. So, Godly Queen Hester is an anonymous play, about 1,200 lines in length. It survives in a single copy of a single and likely only edition, dated to 1561. It focuses on the story of the biblical Esther, here Hester, by first showing King Ahasuerus deciding to seek a wife, Hester taking advice from her uncle, the virtuous Mardocheus, and most notably, Hester choosing to reveal her Jewish identity to dissuade her husband from slaughtering her people, a plan he's been persuaded to pursue by the evil counselor Aman. The play starts with a prologue discussing the nature of honor in ways that resemble the debate about true nobility we find in Henry Medwall's Fulgens and Lucrece. It ends with a prayer for the audience that would not be out of place in any biblical play, with Hester hoping that, like as here they have lived devoutly, so God grant them in heaven to live eternally. Much of the play is in rhyme royal, although the vices mostly use an irregular ballad meter and less frequently rough couplets. In other words, the verse forms in this play resemble those we find in early 16th century plays by my favorite Johns, Skelton and Bale. Scholarly consensus about the likely origins of godly Queen Hester was persuasively established by W. W. Gregg in his introduction to his 1904 edition of the play. Pointing out what appear to be topical references that align Amen with Cardinal Wolsey, Gregg proposes composition most likely occurred between 1525 and 1529, and subsequently Gregg Walker's been even more precise, meticulously explaining how the play's, quote, intense topicality, end quote, links it to the 6-week period around Christmas 1529. The play's representation of a king in need of good counsel, but who is in no way punished for appointing and listening to the proud and greedy Aman, would make it appropriate to present before Henry VIII. And Hester's assertion that a queen must be virtuous because she might need to rule when a king is out of the country engaged in warfare likely alludes to Catherine of Aragon's 1513 regency while her husband fought in France. But taking the late 1520s as a terminus post quem does not account for how the play was understood for the next 30 years, much less explain why printer William Pickering and publisher Thomas Hackett decided to present it as a quarto for sale in 1561. While necessarily speculative, possible reasons for continuing fascination with a play about the biblical Esther emerge when one tracks this figure and the play that bears her name across the 16th century. Only a few years after Walker's proposed date for initial composition and performance, there was good reason to associate the title character Hester not, or perhaps not just, with Catherine of Aragon, but rather with Anne Boleyn. On Passion Sunday, the 2nd of April, 1536, the Queen's almoner, John Skipp, preached a sermon in which he compared Thomas Cromwell to Aman and Anne to Esther. At this time, Cromwell was trying to obtain royal approval for his plan to seize the estates of smaller monasteries on behalf of the crown. As someone aligned with religious reformers, Anne did not wholeheartedly approve of monastic orders, but she and her supporters advocated using dissolved religious houses' wealth for charitable purposes rather than simply to go into crown coffers. According to Dermot McCullough, Skipp subtly altered the story. In the original, Haman offered King Ahasuerus a great sum to finance the massacre, whereas in Skipp's recension, he assured the king that this great sum would be raised as a result, intending in reality to end up with the money himself. Notably, the play's Aman makes a similar promise to the king that the massacre of Jews will bring to your treasure 10,000 pounds of gold. We have no clear evidence that Anne's household staged Godly Queen Hester or any other play during the final years of her life. Nevertheless, scattered records reveal that throughout her short reign, the Queen patronized both players and minstrels, some of whom toured the country, perhaps in the process helping to build support for her ideas. It is not impossible that Godly Queen Hester or other religious plays might have been performed by the Queen's playing company. Based on circumstantial evidence, it's at least plausible to imagine that someone in the first half of the 1530s staged Godly Queen Hester, and in doing so offered a contemporary comment on conflict between two key figures trying to offer Henry VIII advice, his chief minister Thomas Cromwell and his wife Anne Boleyn. The play as it currently exists accommodates such a reading. The play does not mention that the Bible presents Esther as the king's second wife after he has put aside Queen Vashti for disobeying his orders. But literate Christians familiar with the story might be expected to know this. Ahasuerus' declaration in the play that he is, quote, comfortless for lack of a queen, which should be our joy and chief solace, because a prince needs to be matched with a princess, lest default of issue should be, which God defend, therefore your counsels first had to marry we do intend. This statement doesn't contradict Henry's sense that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid, and thus failed to bring forth the only issue he understood to be important, a living male child. Like Esther, Anne Boleyn might be seen as having been selected from among, quote, fair maidens that be virgins pure of this realm, end quote, since she was an English woman, not a foreign princess. And as the play's queen defends the Jews from persecution, Hester might serve as a figure of the reform-minded Anne, who tried to protect evangelical thinkers. But I don't want to debate whether the play originated with Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon. Such an argument isn't necessary as long as we assume the text was not encased in amber and left unchanged between an initial performance sometime at the end of the 1520s and its initial printing in 1561. And this play does show signs of revision. Notably, the vices are strangely integrated. In a scene entirely detached from the play's plot, vices, pride, adulation, and ambition don't meet with the villainous Aemon, much less tempt or change him. Rather, they indicate he already has all of their qualities. Aemon's dialogue with the vice Hardy-Darty is peculiarly dropped into the middle of a meeting between Aemon and the king as an excuse to make explicit that, quote, it is the common word Aemon is a lord, and Aemon is of price, and hath pretty all this country at his rule and device. The addition of vices to what might have previously been a play that concentrated entirely on staging events from the Book of Esther seems to have been an attempt to align what originated as a drama for performance at court with the conventions of popular drama presented by traveling companies. And while we're unlikely to ever recover documentary evidence of when and by whom this play was performed, the surviving playtext includes elements of both elite performance involving chapel boys and popular performance by a small troupe of players. Hester responds to news from her uncle and other Jews about Aemon's planned genocide by declaring, quote, we trust by meek supplication, first unto God by humble oration, and then to the king by desire cordial, a mean to find for to safeguard ye all. But rather than following this statement and the end of her rhyme royal stanza with a prayer, and we might very well expect a prayer because Hester's prayer is a important part of biblical apocrypha. Instead, Hester commands, call in the chapel to the intent they may sing some holy hymn to speed us this day. In the margin next to this couplet, a stage direction clarifies, then the chapel do sing. The availability of chapel choristers not only suggests a performance at court or in an elite household, possibly in a church, but also explains who might appear at the moments when stage directions invite crowds. For instance, when Hester is first seen by the king's pursuivant, as he brings on stage, before he meets her, quote, many maidens. Yet there are numerous scenes in this play that are structured so that all of its speaking parts could be handled easily by 5 men and 1 boy, with the boy taking the part of Hester. And actually, if the boy taking the part of Hester doubled Hardy-Darty, you could do it with 4 men and 1 boy. The opening scene features King Ahasuerus conversing with 3 gentlemen counselors until, after 100 lines, one of them starts speaking as Aemon, next to whose first line a permissive stage direction appears in the margin to indicate, quote, one of the gentlemen must answer, which you will. Such casting economies are more typical of plays for traveling companies than those intended for performance at court. And the difficulty of reconciling sections of the play that suggest a populated stage with other moments that facilitate performance with a very small cast seems to me best explained as further evidence of revision. Indeed, Godly Queen Hester might well have survived as a play text until it was printed in 1561 because, at least once, it was reworked for a different performance context than the one for which it was first composed. But what reason could there have been to print this play in 1561? The few studies that consider the text in relationship to this historical moment strive to link it to Queen Elizabeth. And Elizabeth might have perceived some connection between the biblical Esther and her mother. William Latimer reportedly told Elizabeth Tudor after that queen had come to the throne that Anne supported a campaign of preaching in her last months of life, in which clergy argued for proper use of wealth taken from religious houses, and thus Latimer could have shared what he remembered about John Skipp's sermon. In his 1559 refutation of John Knox's diatribe against female rulers, John Aylmer compares Anne Boleyn to Esther, claiming that papal corruption would not have been ousted from England during the reign of Henry VIII, quote, if God had not given Queen Anne favor in the sight of the king as he gave to Esther, end quote. Presenting Elizabeth with representations of or references to Esther, perhaps even staging a play focused on this character, could have functioned to memorialize the queen's mother. But even more, there's reason to believe Elizabeth might at times have considered herself akin to Esther, a godly queen who sought to protect God's chosen people. In both her own prayers and speeches, and in texts written about her and dedicated to her, Elizabeth was regularly compared to Esther as well as to other admirable biblical queens, especially Deborah and Judith. The printed playtext of Godly Queen Hester links itself to the reign of Elizabeth. Not only does the title page say the play is, quote, newly made and imprinted in this present year, 1561, but also when Hester's petition to protect the Jews is signed in the play, it seems to refer to the same date. And right after the petition, the reading of the petition ends with text that says, as it was meant the 13th day of December, dated at Susis, this is certain, the 4th day of December, the 3rd year of our reign. 1561, when the play was printed, was the 3rd year of Elizabeth's reign. It might have been prudent in the early years of the new queen's time on the throne to offer Elizabeth a play that featured another godly queen. But even describing Godly Queen Hester as in many ways amenable to possible performance before or reception by Queen Elizabeth still doesn't answer the question of why the play was printed. And turning to this issue forces us to attend to an element of the play largely overlooked in critical discussions: how this play represents marriage. The title page verse says who this play is for, and I think we need to take seriously its call to what it imagines to be its ideal readers. Quote, come near virtuous matrons and womenkind, here may ye learn of Hester's duty. In all comeliness of virtue you shall find how to behave yourselves in humility, end quote. The play could teach such matrons and women a great deal about holy marriage, as it repeatedly stages Hester's behavior as emblematic of wifely obedience. When Hester overhears the laments of the Jews, she does not approach her husband directly, but rather plans how she will act by meek supplication, first unto God by humble oration. Upon seeing his wife, the king offers Hester, what ask you, lady, and what you do demand, half our realm is yours if you command. And a few lines later, he states, wherefore, as we said, we would ye should demand, and at your pleasure your petition make, the one half of our realm, if ye command, we shall with depart only for your sake. But the meek and humble Hester only asks that her husband attend a banquet she has prepared, thus demonstrating and delimiting her influence and authority to that of a good housewife. Once she presents the case in defense of her people, she allows her husband to come to his own determination and then refuses to deviate from perfect obedience to his will. Hester seeks no fortune or power for herself, contentedly turning over the executed Amon's fortune to her surrogate father figure Mardocheus. For much of the play, Hester is not a queen who rules, but a praiseworthy wife, offering a role model different in degree but not in kind from another humble woman married above her station, patient Griselda. Readers of the printed playtext in 1561 might well see it as a source of domestic advice more than as counsel fit for a king. There is some reason to believe the play's publisher, Thomas Hackett, had such an audience in mind, since a number of the texts he had printed between 1556 and 1590 were reform-leaning religious or moral texts intended for a popular, sometimes female readership. So, for example, his Theatrum Mundi, which he printed in 1566 and 1574, offered cautionary examples of the downfall of evildoers like Amon. But more notably, in relation to this play, he published texts like A Letter Sent by the Maidens of London to the Virtuous Matrons and Mistresses of the Same in Defense of Their Lawful Liberty, published in 1566, and The Householder's Philosophy, published 1588, that are explicitly concerned with female virtue and purport to offer advice to women readers. Like Godly Queen Hester, a number of Hackett's other publications feature title page or prefatory dedicatory verses that speak to intended readers and make clear the morals they should derive from the book. Kirk-Melnikoff describes Hackett in part because of these prefatory addresses as, quote, an inveterate champion of his own publications, end quote, and Hackett's oeuvre is evidence of his sustained interest in presenting texts for reading. This might help to explain one additional curious feature of Godly Queen Hester as a playbook. As it survives, the play seems unperformable in sections without significant intervention. There are sufficient stage directions for a reader to determine what action is taking place at any given moment, but at a number of moments, necessary entrance and exits are missing. So for example, Seance dictates that Aemon must exit after Ahasuerus orders him to be hung on the gallows he constructed to execute Mardochæus, since the next we hear of Aemon is that a messenger comes in to report that he's dead. But there's no exit. And then there's no entrance for the Vice Hardy-Darty, who then speaks with the king for about 50 lines. And there's no indication of whether Hester remains present on stage throughout this conversation. This scene with the Vice, as I mentioned earlier, may well have been the result of revision for popular performance. But the failure to suggest which characters are on stage in any given scene, I think, is clearly evidence that we have a printer and publisher who are much more interested in producing a moral treatise for readers than in offering up a play that could be put on by 5 men and a boy. And indeed, this is a play that doesn't have a doubling chart and doesn't actually seem to present itself as in any way as a text for performance. Tudor plays transformed into texts for reading have not been considered as a possible influence on how later playwrights might have come to think of themselves as, quote, literary dramatists, but the work of publishers like Hackett offers new evidence of how and why plays might have become texts that seemed marketable to readers. In sum, even in this set of roughly sketched ideas, the case of Godly Queen Hester hints at the questions and interpretations that can arise when we see plays that have early Tudor origins, not just as records of an early Tudor performance that we're trying to recover, but as having the same kind of productive flexibility as medieval drama. Early Tudor drama mostly survives in printed playbooks, making texts seem more fixed and stable than perhaps they ever were. The uniformity of a printed page elides the many hands that might once have existed in a manuscript as signs of revision, expansions, and deletions. Inserted slips that updated a text or the stubs that were remnants of removed pages are no longer detectable. A printed playbook might best be seen not as a stable text, but as an archive of potential and actual drafts, performances, and readings. Diachronic contextualization can help to peel apart the layers that a playbook contains. And Hester's but one of numerous early Tudor plays that seems to have survived only after taking a long and winding temporal journey. Just to give a couple of examples, the anonymous contention between liberality and prodigality seems to have originated in the late 1560s, but there's evidence it was performed at court in 1601, and it survives in a single edition from 1602. Why might the Queen have wanted to see it performed, and who might have been interested in reading it in the first years of the 17th century? Early Reformation plays by John Bale, as well as the anonymous New Custom, were published in the 1570s, and apparently with revisions. How might the theological arguments of these plays have been received after the establishment of the Elizabethan church settlement? And why might the comedy Tom Tyler have survived in a way that made it possible and desirable for Francis Kirkham to produce a quarto of it in 1661 with a title page declaring it was, quote, printed and acted about 100 years ago? And that is the only surviving edition of that play. In the case of such plays, the question, when was early Tudor drama, will remain difficult to answer in any simple way. Even so, I think the time to think about these plays as complex records of performance, reception, readership, and survival is now. Thank you very much.